this provides a little bit of an update from the Female Analyst Working Group, but the latter slides are focusing on sort of like 4-stage clearance data and how useful is that data? How useful is it to the industry from an analytical perspective, but also for the licensed sector as well? But clients as well, it probably will be useful for clients. So for very, very sort of quick, I've put a few slides in just as a very sort of recap, a quick recap as to Female Analyst Working Group has been going now for, it's nearly 2 years. It was first established on the back of the FAM conference in 2021. And from the back of that, it was sort of recognised that analysts are actually sort of put in quite a challenging position when they're on site. They're often there sort of on their own. They've got sometimes quite difficult decisions to make or difficult information to put across. And I'm saying quite often they will be there on their own. It might be out of hours, it might be a weekend, and they can actually be sort of quite vulnerable to abuse and unacceptable behaviour. So then sort of taking it to the next sort of stage, females were sort of considered to be even more vulnerable, even in a worse position. And some of sort of like the instances of sort of physical and verbal abuse that analysts were being subjected to was actually sort of quite horrific. So the working group was set up just to try and look at this, and it was with female analysts in mind to start with, but anything that the working group does, I think everybody will agree, will be benefiting all analysts. But the initial mindset was looking at the vulnerability of females and if there was anything we could do to make the situation better. The group itself, again, it's just a voluntary group. One of the main, everybody on the group's female and also has experience of 4-stage clearance testing. But we do have quite a nice mix, yes, consultancy, client, regulator, whether that's HSE or unofficial regulator through UCAS. So that we don't basically miss something. If we're trying to look at things that, maybe this is useful or we can make a change, that we get all the right sort of perspectives around the table. And we do have sort of regular meetings just to try and work on things and see what we can push through. Our very first meeting, which I say was, it'll be 2 years ago in December, we tried, I'm sure it's like lots of things where there's lots of brainstorming and you're trying to figure out, well, where do we start? And there was the usual banter about all the horror stories and things that people have seen over the years. So we thought it was important just to understand what's the scale and range of abuse out there. Are we talking about something that's very minor, very limited? Are we talking about something that affects lots of people and it might not be particularly nice? It's very horrific. But one of the areas as well was looking at anything we can do to reduce that level of sort of vulnerability or susceptibility, and particularly, when people are having to decontaminate on site, are there instances where that just is not necessary? Do they have to be undressed? We were sort of considering things like, do we need a helpline so that there's a helpline there for support? But also, do we need any more guidance for analysts for 4-stage clearance testing? But more so as well, do we need company policy statements that are a little bit more robust, that will sort of support the analysts? So lots and lots of things for us to sort of just try and take on board. I thought I'd just give you a few slides just to show where we've got to before we sort of look at the data. And I know some of you will be already familiar with this. One of the things that we did quite early on was to try and get an idea of the sort of scale of abuse, and whether or not it was something that was historical or whether it's sort of still happening. Unfortunately, it was something that was still happening. It wasn't historical. So the sort of current environment, things haven't moved on a huge amount, even though we have lots of changes in other areas. And the sort of information that came through was sort of quite harrowing, from the whole range from sort of just verbal abuse that might in some instances be sort of taken as a bit of banter, just right the way through to some pretty awful sort of horrific physical abuse as well. So we set up sort of 2 confidential email addresses so that if somebody felt they'd been, had unacceptable behaviour, but they didn't know who to turn to, they couldn't speak to their own organisation, or they didn't feel they could, there was just another option where somebody else, they could speak to somebody else. We then also looked at, I sort of touched on a minute ago about whether or not you always needed to be ready to decontaminate, which I know is one of the lines in the guidance, preparedness for decontamination, with the acceptance that analysts probably shouldn't really need to go through full decontamination, because when the area is handed over to them, it should actually be clean. They're just going in to do that final check that, yes, you have actually done what you should have done, or if they spot anything, they come out, so they're not actually putting themselves at risk. So looking at that, although at the moment all the requirements are, although they need to be prepared, that means they need to be undressed. So although they may not need to use the shower, they have to be in a position where they could use it if they had to do. So looking at sort of like the decontamination units, and then looking at the sort of CDM requirements and the requirements for them to be able to have a unit that was lockable, and it was basically they had control, they could lock it from the inside. Then looking at the sort of units that are normally used on site, it was quite apparent that you lock them from the outside, you don't lock them from the inside. So there was a bit of a gap or a failing in that regard, and particularly because if it was a female analyst on site, you know, the removal contractors, operatives are usually male, so we didn't have the separation of sort of facilities between male and females either. So that was one area that we looked at, but some of the progress, the manufacturers and suppliers of decontamination units have actually been working on this to try and address it. I know Beacon did do some work probably about a year ago, where they introduced a magnetic locking system, so that when the analyst went into the unit, they had complete control of it. They could lock it from either end, so nobody could come in either accidentally or not accidentally whilst they were in the shower unit. I think there are still a few issues with that, with sort of movement of the units and things like that, but the suppliers are actually looking at other alternatives as well. So there is quite a bit of movement in that area to try and make the unit as secure as possible. And I know HSE have sort of been doing, well, one of Sam's colleagues, Matt Greenley, has done a number of sort of sessions on welfare facilities on site and what should be included, with a focus then on the removal sector as well. So there is a lot of movement to try and address sort of like a number of issues. But then we also started to look at, well, if we're looking at this, and some of the worst examples of sort of like abuse were when people were undressed, was there a need for them to be undressed? So it's like, what risk should the analyst really be at when they're going in to do a clearance? So we started to investigate whether or not we were putting an analyst in a position that we shouldn't be putting them in the first place, therefore increasing a different risk, i.e. the abuse risk. So part of that was then to try and look at, well, okay, we talk about clearance testing, we talk about failures, but we didn't actually have any real sort of data to back that up. You know, is it a case that every time the analyst goes to site, the removal contractor hasn't done a good enough job, so it's always failing, so they're always being put at risk? Or is it a case of, well, it happens 50% of the time or 10% of the time? So once we started to delve into it, the top and bottom of it was we just didn't know. We were aware that there are failures, but we didn't know how many failures. So I did actually send out an email to try and collect data, which is a while ago now. It's probably about a year ago. So thank you to everybody that did supply information on that. That was the sort of start of this journey, just to try and understand what we were dealing with, because without being able to understand it, we couldn't then try and fix it. When the data was provided, it did come back in lots of different formats. It was extremely difficult to try and really sort of understand it. So it was a case of trying to put it into one sort of format where we could actually use it. We could try and sort of look at sort of like different ways of streamlining it, picking out little bits of information. So it did take a little while. And I know I've sort of spoken to people since about collation of data and maybe better ways of sort of putting forward information. But what we wanted to do, and certainly the first lot of information that came through, we were looking at how often do clearances fail and at what stage do they fail? And also, As I say, because the data came through in lots of different formats, some organisations provided a huge amount. The way the data was collected, they collected absolutely loads, to the point of each time it failed, if it failed at the air monitoring stage, they actually had the air monitoring results as well. The other end of the scale was you would just get, yeah, it failed, or it failed at sort of stage 2 or stage 3, but you didn't really get much more. And in some instances, there was data that would tell you what the product was, what the size of the enclosure was. So it was a challenge, but it has been a useful process. I've put some of the statistics together. The pie charts and the graphs are showing exactly the same information. I've just displayed them differently because sometimes people like to look at something in one sort of format rather than another. The data that we used, it was a huge amount, and you'll see the purple colour, that's, well, the whole circle is the number of 4-stage clearances. The purple colour are the number that pass, and the little slither are the number that failed. But then looking at the actual data itself, that was based on over 32,000 4-stage clearances. So it wasn't a small amount of information. This was based on quite a sizable sort of chunk of information. And then looking at it, it was just over 8% or 8.5% fail, the 4-stage clearance. So it suddenly starts to give you a little bit of perspective that although there are lots of clearances going on out there, they don't regularly fail. They do fail, which is why it's important that clients and people understand that you will get failures from time to time. And it's not necessarily because that licensed contractor has done a rubbish job. We do just get failures. So, but we're not getting them on a mass scale. If we then start to look at the sort of where the failures actually occur and trying to understand it, again, the pie chart and the graph give you the same sort of information. I'm just going to move this so I can turn around and look. So picking through the data, we did have failures at stage 1, very, very sort of small percentage. Yeah, it's working now. Stage 2, probably not surprisingly, is where the largest amount of failures occur. So we're getting close to 6% of those enclosures that fail will usually fail at stage 2. We do get a reasonable number that fail at stage 3, so we get just over 2% that fail at stage 3, and then a tiny amount that fail at stage 4. And I'm guessing if you'd have sort of said at the beginning, right, where do you think it'll fail? Most people probably would have said probably the visual inspection. So the data sort of supported that, but at least it is data. We have actually got some figures in there now. But then understanding it a little bit further, and looking at sort of like, if we're getting these failures at stage 2, do we need to do anything different as well? Do we need to provide any more advice or guidance for the analysts as well when they're going into an enclosure to make sure that they are going to be protected? And if you bear in mind, a lot of this was, you know, the initial outset was, do they actually have to be undressed? Are we putting them in a position where they could be exposed? So anything we could do to reduce that sort of prospect was what we were sort of considering. So it was, I know the guidance, the analyst guide talks about 10 minutes. If there's going to be more than 10 minutes worth of cleaning, the analyst has to come out. That's all so that they're not being put at an unnecessary risk. But it was sort of fairly apparent that sometimes analysts go in and maybe they get stuck in a little bit too quickly. Maybe they just sort of focus on one area initially and go a little bit to the nth degree rather than doing a little bit of a sort of like a cursory walk round. So it was, do we actually need some additional sort of guidance to sort of try and help them in those areas? So that is an area that we are working on at the moment, and I've got a couple of slides on that. But then again, looking at stage 3, because if we can control sort of stage 2 by saying, well, you shouldn't be in there. If you think it's not clean enough, you need to remove yourself from the enclosure. We've still got, okay, albeit a small number, we still had a percentage of failures at stage 3. Now, unfortunately, as I explained before, when the data came through, not everybody was collating the data for stage 3 failures, other than it's failed. But there were a reasonable number, 474 air test results out of that data where it failed at stage 3. So it was then a case of, well, if it's failed at that, what sort of levels are we talking about? So to try and understand the personal exposure element of it, found, looking at the air test results, that there was a range from 0.01 or just over, because it had failed the clearance, right the way up through to just over the control limit. But looking at the pie chart again, this gives you fairly good sort of breakdown. So although we were getting failures all the way up to this sort of top end, the vast majority of them, when they fail between 0.01 and 0.019. So yes, they're failing, but it's still not a huge amount that's in there. So again, looking at how much of a risk is that of the analyst having been contaminated. So carrying on with that sort of data, it's a snapshot of data. It's a reasonable snapshot because it's more than 32,000 individual clearances. I say we did get varying levels of information because it would be nice to drill down even further into it, but we have approached the main software providers, and I know Start Technology are here as well today, who've agreed to assist in trying to provide sort of data out of their systems, just to not name anybody, it's all anonymous, but just to look at the clearances and can we extract any more information out of there, just to give us something that's a little bit more consistent, and particularly on sort of stage 3. But we are in the process at the moment. We have sort of like got a draft document at the moment, which is guidance on wearing of clothing when you go inside an enclosure, so that there may not always be the need to be fully undressed, but it is based on risk assessment. And the guidance document at the moment uses this data, but it also goes through some older data as well, because there was research done on this in the 1980s as well, where analysts were being monitored every time they did a clearance to see what sort of levels were being generated whilst they were actually doing the clearance. So, but one of the important things is to stress it always has to be based on a risk assessment as to what sort of site is it that you're going to? Do you know the contractor? Are they generally a good contractor? But also, what's the product? So there will be, or the intention is, there is a section with a table that gives some, ideas of, in this type of enclosure, it may be permissible to wear your street clothes with your overalls over the top. But the ultimate would always be, if something goes wrong or you've suddenly ripped your overalls and you think you would have to lose your clothes afterwards, that would be the extreme. So it does sort of try to simplify it and break it down. But as I say, I can't stress much about the sort of the risk assessment element of it. But the other guidance that I sort of touched on before was just on something for the analysts, so that when they go into the enclosure, it just pinpoints in simple terms. You should actually just do an initial inspection. These are the key areas you should be looking for depending on the product. These are examples, because it's got lots of photographs in. These are examples of where you should look, and if it looks like this, you should be coming straight out. Don't prod and poke at it. But also that it's easy to read. It's not some huge document that they're just going to stick in the boot of the car or leave it on the tablet or the phone. But it should also be useful for larks as well, because I know sometimes there is a little bit of friction on site because the lark doesn't necessarily understand what the analyst is doing, but vice versa. So this is more a case of, this is what the analyst is doing now. They're doing this initial inspection. These are the places they will look at, but it will also be useful for the larks because those are the inspections that they should be doing as well. Yes, we've just got examples of photographs, just sort of key areas for them to sort of home into. And there are ones depending on the product, whether it's AIB, whether it's thermal. So it sort of, rather than it just be a blanket one, it's sort of trying to give some practical guidance. So the last part of this now is really just to look at as well, trying to tackle the other bit about, if somebody is being abused on site, whether it's verbal or physical, it's who do they turn to? And obviously the normal course would be their own company. And although all companies will have some kind of HR policy, some kind of documentation, more often than not, it's not sufficient to actually sort of cover these sorts of situations. So this guidance will actually sort of take it through. We're giving examples of at the bottom end of the scale right the way through up to the bits that would be obvious that they weren't acceptable, and categorises it as well into what type of abuse it is. But the idea behind this is more for probably the company, with maybe a training element for the company, for them to appreciate that their staff will be potentially sort of in fairly vulnerable sort of situations, but they need to know that they've got a route to speak to somebody, or they've got a route to be able to sort of raise issues or concerns that they've come across, rather than it just be a policy that's sat there that nobody ever touches and it never sees the light of day. So we initially, when we looked at this, it was very much, well, why do we need that, or who would enforce it? We can say all these wonderful things, but you should have a policy, and this is what good looks like. And this is probably where sort of UCAS come in as well, because all these companies that are doing these clearances have all got to be accredited. So it was whether or not we could drive it through from the UCAS perspective. And for those of you that are accredited, you'll know that HR policies and things like that is not UCAS's remit, whereas we were able to sort of flag the fact that if an analyst is put in that position and they're feeling quite threatened and quite vulnerable, it will have an impact on the results. It will affect the quality of what they're doing on site. So it immediately becomes back into the arena for UCAS to sort of focus on or to consider. So another good area for then trying to sort of bring a bit of joined up thinking for it. So I say that sort of pressure on somebody on site, it will affect the results. Even if it's just, a little bit of unwanted sort of attention or behaviour or whatever, if an analyst is feeling particularly sort of threatened, they're going to rush, they're going to want to get out of that situation. It's quite natural. So we were sort of just looking then at sort of expectations. Yes, somebody comes to site, they're an analyst. Yeah, that's the sort of thing they might expect to see. Yeah, you've got, your airlock, leading onto your enclosure. We're not for 1 minute saying that analysts expect to be in this sort of environment, this lovely environment out in the sort of sunshine and everything else. So it's managing those expectations. But at the end of the day, lots of the things that are going on is actually criminal. So that's the final end of the scale there. So we know that there are lots of challenges out there. And we also know that nobody likes any sort of criticism. Nobody likes being told that maybe their job isn't up to scratch. Maybe they've not done the work properly. So a lot of it is about better training, being able to maybe deliver that sort of feedback as well, considering sort of like the softer skills rather than just the technical aspect of it, and looking at sort of client sort of conflict resolutions. So there is still a long way to go, but I thought the 4-stage clearance data was particularly useful to be able to look at that. I don't think it is the big problem that we might have originally perceived it to be, that we don't have huge amounts of failures, and we're not looking at failures where there is large amounts of asbestos being generated into the air. So it's more about probably in the end as well a mutual respect for people understanding each other's roles. So I think it's probably important just to sort of finalise with, there is a moral duty out there. Nobody wants to go to work to be abused, whether they're male or female. But from a client's perspective as well, you don't want to end up with that situation. You don't want, an element of reputational damage. Whereas if it's the licensed contractor where you say we just don't want to work with them because we know what they're like, it will impact on clients as well. But there's also, say, the legal implications and whether or not that organisation's fit to hold a licence if they can't actually manage their own staff from a sort of like an abuse perspective.